الملاك تفاوى نحو المنعم عالم.
Welcome to this talk about iconography, and thank you for joining me. I am Fadi Mikhail. Hopefully you would have met me already at one of the icon courses, or if not, then I hope to see you one day soon. So iconography, what is it all about? This talk is going to try and just touch briefly as sort of a beginner's introduction to iconography. It's going to talk briefly about iconography in general, and then it's going to hone in a little bit more about the Coptic style, the history of it, and also the future of it maybe. So iconography, one of the first things I actually came across and had concern with when I was introduced to iconography was, why do icons look so strange? You know, so often in our lives we're shown images that are really quite realistic of Jesus, of the saints, and we can sort of sympathize with those sort of images because they look exactly like us, don't they? They have soft skin, they have maybe blonde hair, brown eye, these sort of things. But when you come across an icon, you're obviously struck with the fact that it is abstract. It's a strange style, isn't it? It's certainly not realistic. So why is that? And I actually came across this wonderful poem by William Blake one day, which was a good example to help me understand just why, or a little bit of an introduction as to why. Let me read the poem to you. It says, "The vision of Christ that thou dost see is my vision's greatest enemy. Thine has a hook nose like thine, mine has a snub nose like to mine. Both read the Bible day and night, but thou readst black where I read white." By William Blake. So what exactly does that poem mean? Hopefully you would have understood roughly what William Blake's trying to say. What he's really saying is that actually the way each one of us understands, sees, really relates to Jesus or the Christ is different. No two people will really sympathize, will really feel the same way about Jesus in exactly the same way. We will all have different perceptions, different imaginations, pure imaginations, personal imaginations of exactly who and how he is. And in a way, that's that's one of the best things about iconography, because we try actually to reduce the style down to the very simple common denominators we know about Jesus, or even about any human being as it were for that matter. We know, for instance, that Jesus was a man. We know that he was a Jew. We know that he is likely to, for that reason, have had a beard, long hair, have covered his head sometimes, for instance. And so we try and reduce him down to these simple geometric forms that just relay this was a human, this was a man, this was a Jew, and not really any more. Because if I go to the next image on this presentation, you see this silhouette. You can see that this person or this statue, probably in some kind of Neo-Gothic architecture, because you can see that round arch. So you know roughly where this might be. It's probably somewhere in Europe. It's a statue of a saint, potentially Jesus, because you can see that figure has a central parting to the hair, and we know that stylistically a lot of realistic statues of Jesus would have that. But you're not given the exact details. You're not giving the exact details of Jesus in that statue. Just a mere hint of this person, and yet you're able to go then into your mind and look at your pure imaginings and sort of fabricate the rest. If we go to the next image, for instance, again, you see this is just a silhouette of someone, arms outstretched. Because of history, because of the connotations this sort of thing draws from your mind, probably who this is. And therefore, it brings to mind actually a lovely phrase about iconography, a lovely meditation that a lot of people say. Icons are like windows to heaven. They themselves, icons, are not heaven themselves, far from it. They are just really wood and paint and man's work in order to try and glorify God and to help his fellow human to see God as much as he can. But really they're just a suggestion, just something to look through and use then your pure imaginings, close your eyes and see exactly what you see. If I go to this next image, it's a horse in a silhouette, but I don't give you the exact colour of this horse's hair or his eyes, and yet you're able to establish just enough so that we can all generically understand and universally accept this as a horse without offending anyone, without touching a nerve on anyone's personal preference as to what colour this horse should be. If I go to this one then, you can see exactly what colour this horse is, the colour of its hooves, exactly. There is no compromising. I'm saying this is exactly what this horse should look like. If I were to give you an image of Jesus and say this is exactly what Jesus is and looks like, there is no room for your pure imagining to work. And we sort of feel, I suppose, in some ways that's unfair in an Orthodox church. Let's move on. A brief history of the icon. So, iconography does have a long history spanning right back to, well, in fact, past Jesus. If we're talking about pre-Christian iconography, yes, I mean, iconography, really the terminology means sort of any symbolic art used for any civilization, any community. So what is the brief history of the Christian icon? When were the first icons made, who were they made by? So, what is a lariton? Lariton is an interesting image. It was actually an image on which the emperor's portrait, the new Roman emperor, was painted, and you can see here sometimes with his family. Now, what's interesting about this is it was actually sent to all parts of the empire and hung in public places, this particular image. And when the portrait was present, the emperor was symbolically present in that place. And sometimes it was decorated with a wreath, and candles were burned in front of it, even used in processions. Why am I showing you this? Because actually, icons themselves have a very, very similar role in the Orthodox Church. And here we have actually the predecessor to the icon is in fact a pagan image, as it were, or a sort of a non-Christian image, that to be more precise, more politically correct, I suppose. So it's interesting, actually, even Christian iconography didn't form itself out of nothing, but has its history in non-Christian habits. Let's move on. Luke the Evangelist. Luke was actually a talented painter, and as well as a physician, as many people know. And there are, in fact, icons that were attributed to him. It said, in fact, he painted icons of the Virgin Mary holding Christ, several different versions of that icon. The location of these icons actually are unknown, but by tradition, the composition of these icons are still in use today. And here they are, well, what we roughly know of them. These three different traditional versions or compositions of an icon of the Virgin Mary and Christ. On the left, you see what we generally know as the Hodegetria icon. In the middle, the icon generally known as the icon of tender kindness. And on the right-hand side, you see what's sometimes known as the Platitera icon, or if we translate the word Platitera, it basically means wider than the heavens. Really, we're trying to say that, what a miracle it is for a human, in a poetic sense, almost to be wider than the heavens, to contain such an immeasurable God inside a womb. Now, there are, in fact, icons that we call those that are made without hands. There are many stories about these icons, and most of them are attributed to moments when Christ would press his face or body against a cloth, and it would actually impress his image onto the cloth. I'm sure you're probably thinking, oh yes, I know tell of those rumours, those stories. And so there is a history of these being in existence. Let's just look at a couple. The Shroud of Turin probably being the most famous among all historians and among most Christians. Now, there have been instances throughout history, back and forth between scientists and archaeologists, saying, we're not really sure if this is genuine, and yet it does show signs of, some miraculous touch, some things we just simply cannot explain how on earth that came to be. Back and forth, and it may still go throughout history back and forth, and we still may never be sure absolutely, is this truly an imprint of Christ's face? But for most Christians, I suppose, actually, we do believe that it is likely to be, and you can see this sort of very long, straight hair, this particular look of Christ, upon which actually most relatively contemporary iconography is styled. And the Veil of Veronica. So what is the story of Veronica? She is actually one of these saints who is said to have been on the road to Calvary, and while Christ was on the road himself, she pressed this cloth against his face to try and dry some of the sweat and blood that was on his face. And doing so, he actually imprinted his face onto the veil. So the story goes. Another interesting one, and probably the most well documented, certainly in writing, is the story of King Abgar of Edessa. Now, this is actually mentioned in a book called The History of the Church by the early Christian historian Eusebius of Caesarea, who in fact was in early time a bishop. What's interesting about this is actually that Eusebius didn't love iconography at all. In fact, he was sternly against the use of icons whatsoever. So for him to have actually noted the existence of something like an icon made without hands, to say, Christ had almost permitted something like an icon to be made, even by his own hands, is quite noteworthy, because it's all the more believable that it really did exist. So the story, what is the story? The king was diseased and sent an ambassador to ask Christ to visit him. And Christ could not come, so sent the ambassador back to the king with a cloth on which Christ had pressed his face and left an icon. And the king was healed upon receiving the icon. Like I said, that is noted in the history of the church by Eusebius. There is actually another one, the woman with a 12-year bleeding. In Luke, Jesus healed a woman having an issue of blood 12 years. You might remember the story where Christ was moving through the crowd and said suddenly to his disciples, "Who touched me? Someone's touched me. Power has gone out of me." And in fact, Eusebius, this same bishop, noted in his book again that he had seen an image of Christ and the woman, which she had drawn on the door of her house, and it was still visible in the 3rd century when Eusebius visited her house. Of course, this isn't an icon made without hands. Clearly, this is an icon made by hands, but certainly one of the first instances we see documented of a believer wanting to relay, the powerful thing that had happened to her in images. Something to remember visually what exactly had happened. The next thing I want to touch on is this term iconoclasm. What does that mean? Literally, the word iconoclast means destroyer of icons. What exactly am I getting at? Now, if we're looking at a history of iconography, we cannot avoid the fact that, in fact, not everybody has always been a fan of icons. Throughout history, there have been groups who have said, yes, absolutely, like the woman who had this issue of bleeding and transferred this image onto her house. We want to portray what we believe, what we see about Christ. And yet a lot of people have said, how dare we make an image of the unforeseen God, or this immeasurable God? How can we make an image of him? It's absolutely sacrilegious that we should do this. And and what are the reasons that these people said so? Well, let's look at their brief history. The Lauraton and other Roman god statues were actually still in use. They were being used in early Christian era. And so, of course, the church clergy, among many others, wanted to keep their churches as separate as possible from all pagan traditions. So, if the icon was anything like the Lauraton, or could be said to be like it, of course, they wanted to say, well, we really need to distance ourselves from anything that could be deemed pagan. And certainly the most important aversion to icons, or the most important reason that many said we really shouldn't be making icons, is in fact the famous prohibition of icons by God himself in Exodus. Let's read it. "You shall not make for yourself an idol in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord God, am a jealous God." Exodus 20:3-5. How on earth can you make an icon after reading that? It seems very obvious, doesn't it? God in Exodus told the people of Israel, I don't want you to make an idol for yourself. I don't want you to bow down to anything except for me. And so, of course, many people, they take that verse and they say, well, of course, that clearly states a prohibition to anything that we can make that looks anything like God, anything in heaven or above, or below, sorry. But what then is the excuse for those who do make icons? What is the reasoning? How can we possibly go ahead and make icons, having read that? And Jesus is the answer to that question. So if we go to this next verse in Colossians and we read it, "For in Christ all the fullness of the deity lives in bodily form." Because of course this prohibition was to the unforeseen God. It was about trying to portray an unforeseen God, yet unexperienced God, a God who had not taken the form of a man who could be represented. And yet when Christ came, he had taken a form. He could be represented. And so what many Christians, most famously St. John of Damascus, who ardently fought for the use of icons and the production of icons, he said, since in history we had not seen God and were therefore prohibited, quite rightly, from making anything that we hadn't seen, when Christ came, what choice did we have but absolutely declare that what was unforeseen had now been seen? We had to declare it in visual images. We simply had to. It was almost a necessary part of our development as Christians. So let's move on now to the style of the icon. We've been a bit through the history now. Let's move to the style of the icon. I've got an image here of an annunciation. It's not in the Coptic style, but the thing I want to draw to your attention are other buildings in the icon. They are strange, aren't they? I'm not talking stylistically. I'm just talking about the perspective, in fact, the viewpoint and the vantage point of these buildings. The building on the right-hand side, we are looking at it almost as if we are underneath the building, because we can see parts of it from underneath and from the right-hand side. And so that's fine. And yet in front of it, we have this throne that Mary sits on, and we're above it, which doesn't make sense, does it? We simply can't be in both places and see these two things in the way we're seeing them. And let's move to the left-hand side of the icon, where we're seeing something, again, from slightly to the right-hand side, but nowhere near as underneath as we were, almost, in fact, slightly above. And, my point is, this really doesn't make perspective sense. This really doesn't make vantage point or viewpoint sense. So what is the iconographer trying to do here? Is it just careless, unknowledgeable, unacademic work? Does the iconographer not know that this perspective doesn't make sense? Actually, far from it. I think the iconographer knows exactly what he's doing. I'd like to quote actually a very good passage from a very good book, Techniques of Icon and Wall Painting by Aidan Hart, a wonderful iconographer in the UK. He talks about what's happening here in the architecture, and what he does, he calls it multi-view perspective. I'll read exactly what he's written. He says, "Sometimes a building is shown as though seen simultaneously from left and right, below and above. This helps us see things as God sees them, and as they are in themselves, and not merely as they appear from our single viewpoint, limited as this is to one place at a time. And the same multi-view perspective is sometimes applied to time, where the same person is depicted more than once in the same image, such as with the Christ in the Nativity icon." So that's really what I'm trying to get at when we look at this particular icon of the Annunciation. Now, this is, as I said, not a Coptic version. If I go to the next slide, what you'll see is a much simpler icon in the Coptic tradition. So you wonder, why is Fadi showing us this? Well, I'm actually trying to show you the same idea of multi-view perspective, but it's significantly simplified in the Coptic tradition, where in fact the only real instance of it is if you look near the bottom of the icon, or even at the throne and then downwards. You'll see the throne, we're seeing it perfectly from straight on, as if we are perfectly aligned frontally with the throne. We can't see any of the sides at all, so we get no three-dimensionality of the throne, which is typical of Coptic iconography. Generally, everything is really quite flat. But then you look at, for instance, the footstool on which Christ's feet are placed, and really that sort of does follow normal perspective. It recedes towards the background and disappears, and we see the thickness of it. And yet, look at the carpet that it's on. The carpet doesn't make perspective sense, does it? It's completely flat against the picture plane. And that's an instance, for in this icon of multi-view perspective. It's significantly more simplified, certainly than its Annunciation counterpart in the previous slide. If we move on to the next slide, you can see again the more instances of it. If you look at the left, you have a Neo-Coptic icon, and you can see this again. The elements of the icon generally are slightly rendered in a three-dimensional way, but when you look at the floor, the tiled floor on the left in the Coptic icon, it's completely flat up against the picture plane. It doesn't make perspective sense. Otherwise, it would, like the painting on the right-hand side, recede perfectly in perfect perspective, and we'd get a much better sense of depth of the room. But in iconography, generally speaking, we're trying to flatten everything up against the picture plane, or if not, then at least not rely and not portray perfect reality of three-dimensional space. To really reflect that we're not trying to show a perfect reality of human existence here. We're trying to actually show something far superior to that, the heavenly reality, or the reality that God sees, which is from everywhere, up and above and left and right. God sees and judges perfectly because he's completely omnipotent. And so we're almost given that view ourselves as Christian viewers. We're offered that somewhat omnipotence like God has. Let's move to the next slide. And you can see two paintings. One on the right hand side is a Neo-Coptic icon of the Platytera that we've seen St. Luke made a type of. And on the left you see a painting of the Virgin and Child, Madonna and Child, certainly more an Italian or European version of the same sort of thing. Now the major differences between these two are probably quite obvious, but let's just go through a few of them stylistically so we can understand the major differences between what we term an Orthodox icon and what we term perhaps just a religious or holy painting. First of all, the major difference is the halo. The halo in the Orthodox icon is it's actually just sort of a diagrammatic symbol of a reality that Christians have witnessed throughout history, whereby someone filled with the Holy Spirit, filled with God, it literally emanates light from their face. There are instances throughout history where, of course, in the Transfiguration, it's noted that Jesus literally poured with light from every part of his being. And more famously in modern history, there's a Saint Anthony of Syros who is said to his disciples to have almost transfigured, and again light beamed from his face in such a way as his disciples said almost reflected like a circle around his head, an aura around his head of light. And so halos really try and diagrammatically depict that reality. You do sometimes see halos in much more realistic versions of these paintings, like the one on the left here, but you very often see them, and I don't think they really portray what we're trying to really portray. You see them almost as a floating disc above a head, almost as if it's a crown of holiness, but it's not a radiance of light, which is what we're trying to do in Orthodox iconography. One of the major differences, again, is that you'll see this certain lack of three-dimensionality in the icon. Yes, there are facial features, and there are sort of light to dark gradations to give us a sense of three-dimensionality in the faces and in the clothing, but generally the icon as a whole is really quite two-dimensional. There's very little background, and in the case of the Coptic icon on the right-hand side, really all you see is a flat surface of gold leaf, or perhaps in this case it's more like silver leaf, to really flatten everything. And that actually comes in the Coptic icon from our pharaonic tradition, our ancient Egyptian art tradition, whereby everything really is quite flat against the picture plane, and that was the imperial art of the time. So really what Egyptian artists are trying to do is maintain that artistic heritage where everything that is an imperial icon, i.e. it's not a realistic version of events, but it's almost like a diagrammatic symbol of an era, or a diagrammatic symbol of a philosophy or theology. Then it becomes a more symbolic two-dimensional image. Again, you can see writing on the icon, Maria Theotokos, or the abbreviation of those words in the icon, whereas on the left in the painting you can't actually see any writing. So that again denotes whether it's likely to be an Orthodox icon or not. You might also see on the outer clothing of the Virgin, the Coptic icon, 3 stars, and these 3 stars actually in Orthodox iconography denote or try and portray what we believe to be her virginity before, during and after the birth of Christ, whereas you would very unlikely see it in a more realistic painting like that on the left. And ultimately what you're really seeing again is the majesty, or the portrayed majesty we're trying to give in iconography of Christ. He is not simply a human baby. Yes, of course, he was born as a human baby, and that in fact is a wonderful miracle of the incarnation, that God, the immeasurable God, the unforeseen, unmade God, became, as it were, made into a human baby with human flesh, timid, fragile, but yet he was so much more at the same time. He was the magnificent creator. And so what you see on the right hand side is a portrayal of, yes, he is human, because he does have human flesh. You can see that he takes it from the virgin who's above him, his mother, and yet he was the magnificent Christ. You can see his hand there in blessing, the same kind of hand that in fact in the Roman period was known as the hand of the teacher or the orator, the one who should be listened to. Let's move on to the next slide and look again more at some stylistic features of the icon. These two icons, I want to just point out what we're really looking at here is the difference in size of figures, the scale of the figures. On the left you see Christ. Proportionately he's huge compared to everyone else. Look at Lazarus, who he's trying to raise from the tomb there, and the two sisters next to him. They're so much smaller than him. His head, his body is significantly larger. Why? Because actually in, again, ancient Egyptian art, in pharaonic art, the imperial art of the ancient Egyptians, the person of importance was always significantly bigger than everyone else in proportion, because we really wanted to sort of fast forward the attention of the viewer to that important person. Everyone else relatively pales in comparison in their importance. So if we look on the right hand side, although it is in fact a St. Christopher type saint, in this case it's called St. Bishoy, carrying Christ, and although Christ is in fact always the most important person really in our existence, of course, in this case it is in fact an icon pointing to St. Bishoy. This is an icon to revere, to venerate St. Bishoy. So Christ is slightly smaller than St. Bishoy, and St. Bishoy is significantly larger than everybody in the icon. And you can see even, another sort of story, or part of the story of St. Bishoy's life in the left-hand corner, and it's significantly smaller than the main character. Now, what am I trying to show you in this next slide? What I'm really trying to point out, in fact, are the large eyes. You can see on the right-hand side a Coptic icon showing very large eyes. On the left-hand side, an old pharaonic painting, the same one we just saw in the previous slide, with very large eyes. Now, why is this? In ancient Egyptian mythology, actually, the large eyes, whether they were painted on with paint on the face, with makeup, they were trying to actually portray that this person is enlightened, because really that was the intention, that was the journey of every person in ancient Egypt, to be enlightened, to reach the afterlife. And so much sort of in continuation, Coptic artists of the later centuries then said, well, yes, actually that's what we're working towards as well. It's a different type of enlightenment, or a different fuller understanding of enlightenment. Now that Christ has come, we understand true enlightenment is to see him, Christ crucified, Christ resurrected, and that we will be resurrected. And so in our art we'll also attempt to sort of portray these rather extended, rather large eyes. If you look at this next slide, what you'll see are these very gestural hands. On the left, you have the very gestural hands in Coptic iconography, and the very gestural hands on the right in pharaonic art. But they do obviously take a very similar style, don't they? You can see very extended, elongated figures, very formally, almost wooden in their style. And what they really mean, you can see these sort of uplifted hands, slightly elevated. What they usually signify is sort of, it's actually usually a hand in awe, or a hand in worship. Depends on the context. So in the case, for instance, of the Virgin Mary with her hands raised there, you can see she's both in awe and worship of the revelation that's being revealed to her, this annunciation saying that you will conceive. And she's obviously saying, wow, yes, I submit myself worshipfully to this case. So let's now talk about the development of the current Coptic icon, because we've seen many examples now of the newer Coptic icons, Neo-Coptic icons, but how did they actually come to be? Because generally we know the icon in history to be quite a historical artifact, don't we? The style never seems to change from the first centuries to modern day, and actually the Coptic icon has undergone quite a significant change throughout the last century. So let's discuss that now. This is a picture of a man named Professor Isaac Fanous. He is unfortunately passed now, only about a decade ago, or in fact. He was a great man. He was in fact my teacher, sadly only for a few months, which is all he could afford me and I could afford him. So who was he? He was actually a layperson, an art teacher in the 1950s and 60s in Egypt. So who's this next man I'm showing you? This is actually the late Pope Kyrillos, or Pope Cyril of Egypt. He was the Pope of the Coptic Orthodox Church around the time of the 50s and 60s. Again, a great man, now sainted, in fact, after having shown many, many miracles, both during his lifetime and afterwards. So what do these two people have in common? Well, actually, Pope Kyrillos, during the 1950s and 60s, commissioned several people to re-establish what knowledge we had lost over the centuries of Coptic culture, both in the arts, in music, in language. A significant lack of academia in those three subjects really worried him, and he said, it's about time that we really felt exactly what it is to have a Coptic icon. What exactly is Coptic iconography? Because the style itself had been really informal, very unknown for many centuries, and there are many, many reasons for that. Not least of all because of the Arab invasion much earlier, pre-10th century, where many, many icons had in fact been destroyed by the Muslim invaders, and so instances of Coptic iconography throughout the centuries had been lost. And so the style, many people weren't exactly sure what is it, the Coptic style, what features are there of it. We know it now because like I'm talking about now, there has been a significant development of it. So Pope Kyrillos actually asked Isaac Fanous to go and study iconography, and then to bring it back to Egypt and to redevelop it into a sustainable, teachable style that could last for eternity, I suppose. So Isaac was actually sent to this man, Leonid Uspensky, who was one of the most, and probably is still one of the most famous Russian iconographers in the world. He again is also deceased, but he remains certainly one of the most famous Russian iconographers of the last century. And I mean, why was Isaac sent there? Because, of course, Isaac had no one to study under in Egypt. There were no iconographers really practicing in Egypt who had genuine knowledge of what iconography was about. We were all sort of grappling in the dark. But in Russia, there had been this timeless tradition of iconography that really hadn't had a break, that had continued for many, many centuries. So Isaac actually studied Russian iconography with Leonid Uspensky in Paris, where he was teaching at the time. He then brought it back to Egypt, and these are actually examples of Isaac's first icons in a church in Egypt, probably the first church that he painted having returned from Paris. And you can see their Russian influence. They're certainly much more Russian than they are Coptic in many, many ways, much more deep in colour, much more rich and deeply saturated in colour than most Coptic icons are these days. And yet there are some features that are starting to show. If I turn to the next slide, you can see that there are certain elements that seem to be somewhat Coptic in nature. Let's just note some of them. One is that the heads are a little bit proportionately large for the bodies, aren't they? The bodies are generally quite squat, whereas if you can compare them to Russian icons that we know, generally the bodies are very elongated, very elegant. If I move to the next slide, what you're seeing here is a few years later, Isaac had already begun to develop a much more stylized or Egyptian style, as it were. That there is a significantly more graphic element to the icons. They're becoming less tentative and much more sure of themselves. The lines are becoming much more sure of themselves, much more delineated, less tentative again. If we move to the next slide, again we're looking now at some late 1960s, maybe early 1970s icons by Isaac. Again, the style is developing even more to become somewhat more pharaonic, somewhat even more squat figures. The heads are becoming larger, and the bodies becoming more stylized, more angular. So if I show you this next slide, you have actually three examples of the same icon, the same subject, but three different stages of Isaac Fanous's career. In the very far left, you see the very first icons that he brought back from France to paint for this first church that he did. You can see, it's very tentative in its style. There's not an absolute surety of his lines. In the next icon in the middle, certainly the lines are much more sure of themselves. They're much more confident in their shapes, and there is generally a greater sense of what the style is likely to be in the future. And then on the far right, this is actually one of the 1990s examples of his work. Suddenly you get a very confident style. It's become not more decorative, as it were, but you can see more decorative elements. For instance, there's the introduction of curtains to symbolize any revelation that's being given in an icon, and all the decoration there, and the faces are becoming somewhat more three-dimensional and so much more I suppose joyous in their slight hint of a smile, where if you compare it to the icons on the left of that icon, they look somewhat almost a little bit grumpy, I suppose. Again, here are 3 more examples of the same subject, but a different subject, but the 3 are the same subject together, but in different stages of Isaac's life. The very far one is one of the very first, again a bit tentative, some would say even potentially ugly. The middle one, much more stylized, much more sure of itself, much more becoming what the style is likely to be. And then by the third, in fact, this isn't an icon by Isaac Fanus's hand, but in fact by one of his contemporary students, Stéphane René. But it's a good example of what Isaac might have done and might have called the Neo-Coptic style, the fully realized, developed Neo-Coptic style. The colors and the style becoming very sure of itself, light playing a part much more than it did previously. And these 3, again, are examples of, in fact, there are examples of 2 different icons. One on the far left is one of the very first apps icons that Isaac Fanus would have done, having returned from France. And on the right, you actually get two photos of the same icon. One of the last apses that Isaac Fanus painted before he passed away. And you can just see the magnificent change between the 2. One is very primitive on the far left, and the next one certainly much more developed in colour, in style, in confidence of the composition and styling. So why am I showing you now a picture of Cubism? I'm sure you would have recognised this. Cubism is because actually Isaac Fanus, when he was developing the style, he really used a lot of different elements of the existing art world to try and develop the style, or to try and make sense of the elements that needed to be made sense of. And what he thought to himself is, when you look at these 2 icons, he actually needed some way to stylize, to make a good sustainable style for mountains and rocks, and he found Cubism to be a perfect example of how to use that. So you can see in these 2 examples actually the use of Cubism in the mountains. And if I turn to the next slide, you can see next to each other the Cubist painting from I believe Austria or Germany, and then the mountainous areas in the Coptic icon. You can see the very, very obvious similarities between them, but it works stylistically. So he actually used elements of Cubism to make sense in developing how we would then go forth and stylize mountains and Coptic icons. And now I'm showing you elements of Italian Futurism, which has a very different manifesto to Cubism. In fact, it's much more about explosive, very dynamic sounds and movements. And if I show you then the next slide, which is a stained glass window by Isaac Fanus, you can see in the background much more organic, flowing, almost explosive, futuristic shapes. And so Isaac Fanus pulled in Italian Futurism, pulled in German Cubism to make the new Neo-Coptic style. Very interesting to know that he used so many different parts of the world to create a much more modern style. So the process is an interesting part of iconography, and one that many people probably go into iconography for, if nothing else, because it's a very ancient process. The same process, in fact, that Egyptians were using for the mummification process or painting on their sarcophagus. And what is it? What you're seeing now in this slide is actually a finished board onto which charcoal has been drawn. A charcoal drawing has been made, rather. Now these white boards that you're seeing, they're actually not just painted acrylic gesso, but real gesso is in fact chalk powder mixed with some kind of glue, whether it be rabbit skin glue or gelatine, almost the same kind of gelatine that we make jello with, or jelly. They're mixed and they're actually painted on canvas, and this canvas has already been stuck on a thick piece of wood, usually solid wood. Some use plywood, some even use MDF. And a canvas is then actually stuck to this piece of wood, and on that canvas is painted this gesso, which, like I said, is chalk powder and some kind of glue. And when that's painted very thinly on the canvas and left to dry, and 8 more or so layers are actually painted onto that, then what you're left with is a very absorbent ground onto which we then paint the icon. And why does it have to be very absorbent? Because actually the paint that we use needs a very absorbent ground. It's very watery, and so it really needs to suck into something. And we know that same method has been used for thousands of years, right through to ancient history with the Egyptians. And there are many examples of very, very well preserved pieces. And so we know that it stands the test of time, that process. So once the board is ready, like you can see now, we actually prepare our designs in charcoal and draw on the board until we're very happy with the drawing in charcoal. Charcoal, because it's very easy actually to wipe away with your hand, very, very forgiving to rework the drawing without having to use an eraser with pencil, for instance. Once you're happy with the drawing, we actually paint over those lines with paint so that charcoal can no longer be rubbed away. And once you've done that, we then begin what's called the gilding process. Now, what we mean by the gilding process is applying gold leaf or any kind of metal leaf. So what you see me doing actually in this image is closing up the pores of this now very absorbent ground, just where I want to apply the glue for the gold leaf, because if I apply glue on very absorbent ground, then actually we'll lose the real strength of the glue. So first we have to sort of seal the pores and then apply the glue so that it sits nicely on the surface, ready for the gold leaf to take. And the gold leaf is applied very gently in squares, overlapping squares, one on top of the other. And once the entire area that you'd like to be covered has been covered with overlapping squares, you then brush away the excess. And once you brush away the excess, you're left with nothing but a very clean sheet of gold leaf, as you see in this next slide, where actually I'm beginning to apply the very darkest colors of all the icons. So for instance, in the faces, we'll be applying the very darkest shadowy color of the skin, and then every subsequent layer will become lighter and lighter. This first layer is actually known as the proplasmos, and this technique generally, where we apply the darkest layers of color first, is known as the proplasmos technique. There is another technique called the membrane technique. So instead of applying the darkest layers first and then every subsequent layer becoming lighter, instead we start with the light canvas, as it were, or the light board, and we apply the darkest color only in the areas of shadow. And then we very slowly begin to build up the shadow and the light at the same time. It's a much more complex technique. The proplasmos is much more linear, as it were. Dark colors first, then everything becomes subsequently lighter. So this is what the icon looks like when the entire icon is covered with what it needs to be to then begin painting afterwards. The gold leaf is in the right place, and all the proplasmos colors are in the right place. And then, as I said, every subsequent layer becomes lighter and lighter. So you can see now that we've sort of redrawn with a slightly darker than the proplasmos color. We've got the features back on, the eyes, the nose, the mouth. We then begin to apply the first layer of light, which is another color, to start to build up the shape, the form of the face. You can see here now the side of the face is being almost carved with light. And the roundness of the face is starting to appear. And as time goes on, you do the same thing with the clothes until everything is rendered in a slightly three-dimensional way. Not three-dimensional. There is still a two-dimensionality to the whole board. And really, that's the whole process of building up an icon, at least in the proplasmos technique. And of course, what you're seeing now is an icon being used, or the icons being used in a service in a church, which ultimately is their final resting place, God willing. Thank you very much for listening and your patience through this long talk.